Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. And for those who are viewing this remotely, thank you. I'm Nina Shea. I direct the Center for Religious Freedom at the Hudson Institute, where I'm also a senior fellow. And today we're going to be talking to Jan Jekielek about his new book, Killed to Order. I have a copy right here. China's organ harvesting industry. And I'm very pleased to see that today it is the #1 Amazon bestseller in the categories of communism and socialism. I think it's #4 in the category of politics overall. So it is just an amazing book, very articulately written and very clear about this horrible, horrific, monstrous crisis that's going on with medicine in China today. Those of us who follow this issue were stunned last September at a hot mic moment when Xi and Putin were discussing achieving immortality, or at least a 150-year lifespan, through, of all things, organ transplants. And this was further confirmation to us of China's leaders' ruthless ambitions that have led to a state-supported atrocity, perverting medicine, where one social class, that is Falun Gong and religious minorities, is sacrificed, that is killed, to prolong longevity for another social class, the political and military elites. Jan's book puts this in context and is an engaging prose, explains what is going on behind the scenes. So Jan is the senior editor of Epoch Times, founded by Falun Gong practitioners. He is an award-winning documentarian on the Holocaust. He has had a TV program with the current FBI director called Cash's Corner, and continues to have another weekly program called American Thought Leaders. His family fled communist Poland. And so Jan will begin by doing a reading from his book. Afterwards, we'll have a discussion about these issues, and then an opportunity for you all to ask questions. So please join me in welcoming Jan to the podium.
All right. Thank you so much.
Forgot to. The books are available for sale after the program right outside the store. And they're also on Amazon. Thank you.
So yeah, this hot mic moment that we experienced just before I start reading from the book for the first time in public, it was an astonishing moment because I knew that there was this elite longevity project, Project 981 they call it. And by some estimates, it's a 10-year increase in lifespan that they've already achieved. I don't know if that's the real number. This is the one that's kind of brandished about in China, actually. And I knew there was, of course, this horrible forced organ harvesting industry, but I hadn't realized, oddly, because I had compartmentalized these things, right, that this forced organ harvesting system is a central part of that elite longevity project. And that was kind of the revelation that came out of that conversation between Putin and Xi. So it's actually, ended up being a very important part of this book. This was kind of as the book was being written and conceived. So very valuable thank you to, the rare thank you to Xi and Putin for supplying this information. So I'm excited to read for the first time in public a few things from the book. And so this is from chapter 1. Nina asked me to focus on a few of the sort of the beginnings of the evidence to start of how we came to understand this. So chapter 1, a rumor so extreme it's hard to believe. Annie, in 2006, the ex-wife of a Chinese surgeon in northeast China, alias Annie, went to the press with a ghastly, shocking testimony. Her story was almost impossible to believe. Almost. I found out about this at the end of 2003, she said. At the time, my husband had become absent-minded and almost robotic. He had been doing it for years, but he had never told me about it. He often had terrible nightmares and would wake up shrieking and terrified. He would stare blankly at the TV. When our child or I touched him, he would shriek. I found him becoming abnormal. He told me, "You have no idea of my agony. These Falun Gong practitioners were alive. It would be okay if we removed organs from dead bodies, but these people were truly alive." She claimed she carried a mobile phone with him, that he carried a mobile phone with him at all times, and at any time it rang, day or night, he would immediately go to remove organs from Falun Gong practitioners who were still alive at the time of extraction. A group of surgeons, Annie said, worked together to remove all major organs, even the skin of the dead bodies, and the dead bodies were cremated. Between 2001 and 2003, about 3,000 to 4,000 Falun Gong practitioners had died as a result of forced organ harvesting at a hospital she and her husband worked at in Sujatun, according to estimates by some of the doctors involved. By the time Annie went public, she estimated that her husband had personally forcibly removed the corneas from about 2,000 Falun Gong prisoners of conscience. In separate interviews with the Epoch Times and David Kilgore, may he rest in peace, a former MP and prosecutor in Canada, Annie told the rest of her story. My husband and I worked at the Liaoning Province Thrombosis Hospital in Sujatun between 1999 and 2004. My ex-husband used to be a neurosurgeon who participated in removing organs from Falun Gong practitioners. So, and I continue with Annie's testimony and some of her story. And of course, she, at this point, when she was giving this testimony, she had already left China. She had managed to escape. Her husband and her were divorced, fortunately or unfortunately at the time. And she, under a pseudonym, incredibly brave woman, decided to come forth with this information. So now, simultaneously, okay, this is near simultaneously, completely independently of this, something was happening in Israel. In Israel, the head of the Israeli Transplant Association, I'm going to flip to the page here, or former head, was Dr. Levy, okay? He encountered an unbelievable situation himself. As it happened, concurrently in Israel, another shocking story alleging a large-scale Chinese organ harvesting operation had surfaced. It was just as implausible, but it too carried that same unsettling and undeniable hint of truth. This situation involved an Israeli cardiothoracic surgeon named Yaakov Levy. Dr. Levy, who had once served as the head of the Israeli Transplant Association, was widely regarded as a pioneer, a hero even, in the transplant surgery community, especially in Israel, where the small population size makes transplants a particular challenge. A little before any stories came to light, Dr. Levy had made a shocking discovery himself. He was treating a patient in need of a heart. The prognosis was grim. Eventually, the patient essentially told him, "Look, I'm tired of waiting. I'm going to China to get a heart I need in 2 weeks. They've already scheduled it." Dr. Levy was incredulous, but the patient didn't seem to mind. He flew to China, received a heart transplant, and returned home. There were some complications, but the end result was undeniable. The patient got a heart and lived. At first, Dr. Levy couldn't make sense of it. A scheduled heart transplant on a 2-week timeline? There was no medical scenario in which that's ethically possible, he thought. By the way, I still remember that I talked to him on the phone about this. Kind of shocking. A heart can only be transplanted from a donor who has just died, and the donor has to have died very recently. And the only way to know in advance when someone is going to die is, Dr. Levy couldn't believe it, but this had actually happened nonetheless. And that was the moment he realized that something horrifying was transpiring. He had heard about Israelis going to China for kidney transplants for years, but being a heart transplant surgeon, he had never dug into it, assuming people that were selling organs. He assumed that people were selling organs. Not that it's okay, not that it's proper, absolutely not, but the idea that somebody would die for the organ never crossed my mind, he told me. The experience propelled him to devote himself to reforming Israel's transplant laws, a mission that would occupy him for years. Dr. Levy would go on to become one of the most outspoken and respected advocates in the early movement to expose and end forced organ harvesting. The legislation he championed barred Israel's national healthcare system from covering transplants performed in China. It also introduced a reciprocity principle. Anyone eligible to receive an organ had to be willing to donate one. This reform increased the domestic supply of organs. Still, in the beginning, he was fighting an uphill battle to bring attention to the public. People simply couldn't believe it, or they didn't want to. I know I didn't want to. But at a point when the evidence and the stories became too much to ignore, it was no longer an abstract political issue, and instead it had become deeply personal. And then I talk a little bit about how I got involved. So that's a second section here from the book, and I'll fast forward now. I basically had to be bashed over the head by the evidence to kind of accept that this was happening. My mind didn't want to go there. I'm one of these people that's unusually skeptical of everything. It's kind of a bit of it's good for journalists, but kind of a hazard in personal life, perhaps. So jumping forward now, we encountered something that I never thought I would ever see. And in 2024, a survivor came forth here in DC, Washington, DC. There's actually someone, so let me read about it. Cheng Pei-ming, the survivor. In August of 2024, I witnessed something truly extraordinary, something I never thought I would see, a survivor of China's forced organ harvesting industry. His name was Cheng Pei-ming. Cheng's story reads like the stuff of nightmares. He was born in 1965 in Heilongjiang province, China, near the Russian border, and he led what he called a normal existence. He was a coal miner. He was married, he had a son. In 1998, he adopted the teachings of Falun Gong, which he states provided him with a meaningful life and also benefited physical health and particularly spiritual growth. However, in 1999, when the CCP cracked down on the Falun Gong movement, his life took a sharp turn. Because I felt I benefited from Falun Gong, he stated, I wanted to tell the government that we are innocent, good people. So I went to protest, and I was arrested several times, a total of 5 times from 1999 to 2002. It was then in 2002 that he was sentenced to 8 years in prison, according to the China Daily, for, quote, using a heretical religion to undermine law enforcement. During his sentence, he was tortured severely, often to the point of losing consciousness. And he was subjected to forced blood tests, an indicator they were considering him for organ harvesting. This is something we only realized over time because these people would be telling us, I was in the human rights field, this is early on, before I stepped into journalism, we were getting this information that people are getting these very expensive tests being done, right? Blood tests and others as well, but we couldn't make sense of it because they were just being tortured in the same prisons. So the torture, however, was not only physical, but mental as well. Mentally, they put me and my family members under pressure as they wanted me to give up my faith in Falun Gong, and if I didn't, they would force my wife to divorce me when I was in prison, he told the diplomat. In November 16, 2004, while being held in a prison in northeastern China, 6 prison guards pinned him down in a Chinese hospital to administer anesthesia against his will. Then he woke up 3 days later, his right foot shackled to a hospital bed. One arm was receiving intravenous therapy, and there were tubes on his feet and chest and into his nose. He began coughing nonstop. He felt pain and numbness around his left ribs. Cheng, who was sentenced to an 8-year term because of his faith, was held at Daqing prison in Harbin, capital of Heilongjiang province, at the time of the non-consensual surgery. Over the next 2 years, while still detained, he suffered from shortness of breath. In February 2006, he began a hunger strike in protest of a new round of torture inflicted upon him, according to experts on Minghui.org, a website dedicated to tracking firsthand accounts of persecution. The prison administered intravenous drips and took him to Daqing Longhang Hospital on March 2, 2006, shackling him again to a bedpost. Weak and under constant watch, Cheng heard the prison guards speaking to his sister who had come to see him. The guards claimed that Cheng had ingested a knife blade and required a high-risk surgery. Later, a white-clad doctor came and pressed on his chest and abdomen, declaring they'd perform surgery on him the next day. Cheng thought that would be the end of him, but an opportunity presented himself. In the early hours of the morning, the 2 exhausted guards monitoring him, fell asleep, putting shackles on him, after putting shackles on him. And he was able to escape, fell asleep before putting shackles on him. He was then able to flee through a fire escape. Okay, I'm not going to read the rest because we need to get into our discussion here. But the incredible thing is, so my father-in-law was a Holocaust survivor. May he rest in peace. And I've interviewed a number of Holocaust survivors over the years, and they all have these unusual stories, basically that they made a decision, and in retrospect, certain death lay this way, and they chose another path, and somehow they made it. And then this happens multiple times, and finally the war ends, and they're just around, and they know everyone else in their family is dead, or mostly, and they're just somehow they made it. And his story reads a little bit like this, and you can read about it in Kill to Order. Thank you for having me here, and I'm excited to speak further with you, Nina.
Yeah, you can see how vivid his book is. It's not a dry human rights report, and it really puts some human faces on what is happening. So I'd like you, though, that said, describe forced organ harvesting as it takes place in China. Describe, just give some further context about it, the logistics, who's involved in it, how it works, the experience of Falun Gong about being the target victim class initially.
So, yeah, let me just explain how this is different from your run-of-the-mill. I mean, I'm kind of joking because any organ trafficking is atrocious and horrible. But this is a whole different level, frankly, of evil that we're talking about, right? You need to have a state actor involved. In this case, it's the Chinese Communist Party. It's a unique set of circumstances. Why do you need that? Because you need to be able to push massive propaganda through a population and be able to dehumanize a group of people, okay? And the Communist Party in China has been expert at this over decades, right? They started with the landowners. They wanted to seize their land, and they were the enemy. And they were dehumanized, and that kind of activates this quirk in our psychology when, most people will not harm their neighbor just casually, right? That's just not something we do as human beings, but we can be tricked through mass propaganda when we start believing that people are lesser than or somehow dangerous, right? Somehow pariahs in society, dangerous to society. So that element has to be there. And also, you have to be able to incarcerate a huge group of people. I'll explain in a moment how you get these 2-week wait times, right? But basically, so this is what they did with Falun Gong practitioners back in 1999. Just to frame that, this is a spiritual discipline. People are practicing truthfulness, compassion, and tolerance. In another translation for it, actually, I was reminded recently when I was at Hillsdale College giving a talk, they focus a lot on goodness. And actually, another way to translate truthfulness, compassion, and tolerance is to be true, good, and endure. So this is what people are living, and it's a very unusual for the Western mind to kind of capture. There's no organization of Falun Gong really, okay? There's voluminous teachings written by a man named Li Hongzhi, but it's unusually self-directed. There's no membership. You don't join something. Living the practice is what makes you a Falun Gong practitioner. Living these principles. There's all these teachings, but not a lot of rules. Rules might be things that all Falun Gong practitioners agree on, like there's no collection of money. You're not allowed to enrich yourself from it in any way, right? There's no hierarchy in it. There's no kind of leadership. There's no worship of Li Hongzhi, the founder of the discipline. And there's, as I mentioned, there's no roster. You're not supposed to change the teachings. But and this is what's most interesting. And I thought of this, years and years after being involved in all this early on. If you're a particularly you find someone that's a wonderful Falun Gong practitioner, you're just going to emulate them. You're going to copy them. As I understand it, you can't really do that. You have to understand the teachings and figure out how to live it yourself, right? You can't just copy someone. It's very self-directed. And in a communist society, which is, I would describe as obscenely hierarchical, requiring, to kind of total compliance to the top, to the Communist Party, if I were going to sort of design a system that could basically counter totalitarian rule or somehow survive it, it might look something like this. It's kind of fascinating.
So Jan, so these, the Falun Gong rubs them the wrong way. They're disfavored, and they decide to eliminate them.
So Jiang Zemin says, uses the word eradicate.
Eradicate.
Okay, and that didn't mean kill everybody initially, right? It just means put them into this re-education system, break them psychologically, right? Get them to renounce their faith. Indeed, this was kind of a pivotal moment for me in getting involved, as I met a woman who refused and was tortured. She literally refused to give up her faith, sign a piece of paper, a waiver that would say that, and they were torturing her. And this just really, my parents had escaped communist Poland. I think you may have mentioned that, right? And but I didn't understand communism. I was born in Canada, you know. I lived a very free life, like the kids in the E.T. movie, you know, riding bikes around. What parents? No one. I had complete freedom as in my childhood. It's hard to imagine this, okay? But kind of, if you can imagine what it would look like, right, to suddenly have a whole large group of people incarcerated because it turns out that they're not easily being re-educated. They're not all signing these waivers. And then there's rules in this massive incarceration system of China that say all Falun Gong practitioners will be considered suicides. All Falun Gong practitioner deaths will be considered suicides, meaning you can just work on these people to whatever end. Like, just basically, if they die while you're trying to break them, that's fine, right? This was the unwritten rule. You have this incredibly vulnerable population. One, they've been dehumanized in the eyes of their fellows through this massive propaganda, kind of straight out of 1930s Germany, very similar talking points, okay? And now they're incarcerated. Now you can blood type them, you can tissue type them, you can organ scan them, okay? Now you have a database of their vitals, okay? In a civilized, in an ethical procurement scenario, someone has to have a catastrophic accident. They have to, it's typically a motorcycle accident or a car accident. They have to be not coming back. You can't transplant most organs, aside from corneas, from a completely dead body. There has to be some circulation. So that has to happen. This rare accident and the blood type, tissue type, all that has to match you. So typically you wait months or years for any transplant, right? But here, 2 weeks and scheduled, right? Why? Because these incarcerated prisoners of conscience are already pre-matched to someone, let's say a wealthy recipient who paid 200 grand for a heart, right? They're pre-matched, and the moment that transaction is made, that person is shipped and killed to order.
So they're a living organ bank, basically.
They're a living organ bank.
And there's no consent, obviously. Oh. They're murdered. But that's an important element of this crime.
Absolutely.
And they are transferred, as I understand it, from the prison alive, or if they're murdered, and then quickly transferred to a hospital or a surgery center to remove the organs, and then to the hospital where the patient is.
Right.
So that's basically the route. And so the CCP has gone to great lengths to hide all this, as you know. I think you call it denial, slander, and dismissal is their reaction to these stories and these reports from you guys and from
That's a great
others.
Summary.
Yeah, and well, I would add silence too,
Yeah.
but we can get into that later.
Yeah.
But
I have a whole chapter in the book that talks about how the CCP elicits complicity both from its own population and us.
Yeah, we'll get into that. But they deny that it's happening, and Wang Jefu is a character that you write about. He was a member of the Central Committee of the Communist Party, but he was also Vice President of Health, and then he founded the first donor list, the organ donor list.
Registry. Yeah.
Registry. And so in around 2005, he says that 95%, I read this in your book, 95% of all the organs are taken for transplant, used in transplant, are taken from prisoners. Which prisoners don't have the capacity to give consent because they're not free.
But this is what they would explain to people. They would tell people that are getting the transplant that it's a death row prisoner, so this is okay because they're already going to be killed anyway.
Right. So
I find that reprehensible. That's not consent.
No, it's not consent.
But that's what they would say.
And the world sort of shrugged. Well, they were death row anyhow. But then he turns around in 2015 or 2013 and says by 2015 we're going to stop this practice and and have voluntary, 100% voluntary donations for organs for transplant. So what is the evidence? They're hiding everything. There's one survivor in all these years.
I
It's
never
been
thought we'd ever
20
see one,
years.
but
You're right.
yes.
It's a perfect crime. It's really a perfect crime. So it's because these are people in prison. They're incommunicado. They're isolated. There's no witnesses except different compartmentalized people who take them to be slaughtered, take them the organs to the hospital, to the doctors deliver. So not anybody knows the whole story. But so what is the evidence then?
So in 2000, actually between late 2018 and 2020, there was an international tribunal that was convened by Sir Jeffrey Nice. He actually prosecuted Slobodan Milosevic back in the day. And what this group of, I think it was 8 experts, independent experts, were just charged with assessing the body of evidence. And there's a lot of it. It's what I call voluminous. I'll mention a few pieces which I find particularly compelling, but there's a huge number of lines of evidence in one direction, right? Because the question was, this is what the original researchers, David Kilgore and David Matus that I mentioned, when I was convinced by 17 lines of evidence that were all pointing in one direction, and they really tried hard to find any evidence that there might be a legitimate organ system in China, but there were 0 lines of evidence, and certainly the Chinese Communist Party has never provided any evidence that would suggest a legitimate organ system of any sort to this day in China. In fact, just a comment on this registry, they did provide some numbers of this alleged registry, right? But researchers found that the numbers they provided were basically a perfect quadratic equation. Okay, what this means is they fabricated this data about the registry, and they didn't even do it particularly elegantly. Like, they just did it in an obviously false way. And I don't even understand why they would do that, but that's what they provided, and they've never provided anything else.
So this is
right?
an equation of the growth of donations
Correct.
over time.
Correct. And the problem is, like, when you build this, the moment Falun Gong practitioners get incarcerated en masse, we'll go to 2005. The special rapporteur on torture at the UN, I remember I was there that year, I met him, a wonderful man named Manfred Novak. He estimated that half of all the people in this massive incarceration system of the CCP were Falun Gong practitioners. So, we don't know how many were in the database, but hundreds of thousands for sure. That's enough to get this, kind of instant lack of wait time.
I thought it was fascinating.
Go ahead. No, I was just going to say that they grew it. So there's this low level of transplantation happening in the year 2000, just as the Falun Gong persecution begins. But then it grows geometrically, and by 2005, there's a plateau, and by the end of around 2010, we get 146 hospitals that are doing this transplantation. Again, no credible donation system whatsoever. Okay, and then death row prisoners. Even if you were to pretend that it was death row prisoners, just order of magnitude less death row prisoners than actual transplants happening. Okay, Ethan Gutmann, who's one of the heroes of this movement, he has his own book out right now. Actually, it's called The Xinjiang Procedure. He originally wrote a book called The Slaughter about all this. Well, again, just remarkable work. He likes to embed himself with the groups that he's kind of studying, so to speak. And he did this with the Uyghur people. And this book, The Xinjiang Procedure, is him grappling with what the numbers are there. That's newer information for us, right? But they grew this thing. In 2016, I believe, he defended his assessment of the numbers. I want to mention the scale we're talking about here, right? This is a very conservative estimate, by the way. So he says, in front of Congress under oath, he explains how it's 60 to 100,000 transplants a year, annually, okay? And there were 146 hospitals at the time when he did this calculation. Today there are 200, even though it's even harder for us to get actual information, because every time we would expose more of the evidence, they would make it harder for us to get further evidence, and hence this need for the procedure. These are all from prisoners of conscience to the best of our knowledge. Yeah, to answer your question.
I was just going to. We're going to have a Q&A. Just hang on. I was going to ask you about the hospital numbers, the beds, and Kilgore Mattis went through that, just going on the hospital's websites and seeing how many beds they said they had and making some kind of calculation about how many transplants that would be if there was a certain number per month, and it didn't add up. And so that's an important piece of evidence. And you mentioned another one, which is the short notice. The short time.
So there's a paper in the American Journal of Transplantation. So of course the survivor is a piece of smoke, is a kind of smoking gun evidence that I never thought we'd see, right? Obviously. But there's a paper in the American Journal of Transplantation from a few years back, one of the most prestigious transplant journals in America. It's titled Execution by Organ Procurement. Execution by organ procurement. The authors asked the question, because we know there's this industry happening in China, could it be that in the published peer-reviewed scientific papers in the Chinese transplant literature, people are actually admitting in the methods inadvertently that they're killing people for organs? And the answer they found was yes. Okay, they looked at between 2,000 and 3,000 papers, and they found 71 papers. Again, they were extreme. They had very stringent criteria. There's actually quite a larger number. Just when I looked at the information, I would have probably classified more of these as violations of the dead donor rule. But they were really stringent, and they found 71 instances where absolutely certainly the people in those studies, published publicly, right, were killed by having their organs removed. Okay, this is publicly available information. They're so desensitized to it in China. There's this machine of death that they've created over decades, right? These bureaucracies are very difficult to dismantle once you build them, because if we go with 60 to 100,000, right, a year, that's a $9 billion industry, give or take. It's a lot of cash, plus the unlimited on-demand organs that if you're a super elite, you have organs forever on demand, right? So that I didn't even think of that's worth a lot more than nine. Someone told me, actually, I was doing a show, a TV thing, and I asked them, so what would it be worth to you to have, just if you have zero moral boundary, right? If you're ready to take organs from anybody, any number of people, what's it worth to you to have unlimited organs? And the person said, well, that would be worth everything, right? That would be worth. It's a lot more than $9 billion. It's life, right? If you're willing to have people die, many people die for that life. It just reminded me of this, the Harry Potter series. Voldemort has these Horcruxes. He has to kill people to sort of hide his pieces of his soul. It's a little bit like that, I think. Yeah. It's crazy.
So one of the things that I really liked about your book was that it drew lessons from the Falun Gong case, the Falun Gong experience. And it's an important lesson for all Westerners, for all Americans at this time, is what is the nature of this regime that we're dealing with now, at least in some government circles here, I think Federal Trade Commission calls it an adversary. Much of the government still calling it a competitor, but what is the true nature? There's, what does monetized persecution, religious persecution, tell us about this regime? You use the term pathocracy. Can you talk about that? Because I thought that was a brilliant insight and how that works.
If I could just mention one more thing that I wanted to share. Just before that, thank you for noting that. It's incredibly important. For 14 or 15 years, no one really did anything about this. International multilateral institutions basically, in effect, kind of ran cover for this. Okay, it was enough to know that you can get this 2-week wait time, right? It was really enough to know that there's something horrible was happening, and international institutions should have stepped in, the Transplantation Society, the World Health Organization, whatever, but nothing. So they added another group of people. They built this on the backs of Falun Gong practitioners, and then they added the Uyghur people. You know about this, right? Very isolated, vulnerable group, much smaller than Falun Gong, ethnically unique, unlike Falun Gong, which is a cross-section of the entire society. And essentially the whole place runs like a police state up there. They have a strategic interest in eliminating these people. In fact, the US official position is that they're committing a genocide of those people. They're eliminating them entirely. They have a process of doing that, right? And so they dehumanized them and put in millions of them in camps, and you started working on them, right? And now, right, and this is very relevant because this is the Center for Religious Freedom we're doing this at. I anecdotally noticed that there's dehumanization language, an uptick, right? I just kind of observed this against Christians, right?
Yeah.
We have the Zion Church being rolled up. We have this controls on the Catholic clergy being added. I mean, and I actually talked to Bob Fu, who runs a ministry called China Aid, supports persecuted Christians, and he agreed with me. I actually had him on the show, American Thought Leaders, a little while ago, and he said, no, absolutely, we're seeing that. So, you know, and this is someone said, so are you saying that Christians are next? And I said, no, I can't say that. I don't have a crystal ball. Can't see the future, but I can tell you that this dehumanizing language always precedes atrocity. It's just how it happens every time, because you have to kind of convince people that these are somehow evil, lesser than you people, right? So just on this point, pathocracy, okay? Yeah.
You've brought to mind some things for me too that I just want to mention. You mentioned blood sampling and tissue taking, testing, and which is another piece of evidence. And I interviewed a Christian who had that done to him when he was in prison. So that's another early
multiple
sign.
lines of evidence,
Yeah,
absolutely.
multiple lines of evidence.
Yeah.
And I'm happy to say that I learned yesterday that Ethan Gutmann is going to come and give his book talk next month. So stay tuned. We're going to have him talk about how this is happening to the Uyghurs as well. And like you said, if they can have genocide, if they can genocide them, why wouldn't they be doing this? I mean, what's to hold them back? But we'll get into the moral thing in a minute. I wanted to pursue this pathocracy.
Yeah. So
I thought it was brilliant.
So there's a man named Andrzej Łobaczewski, is how you pronounce it in Polish. I'm a native Polish speaker, who was a student of psychology at the Jagiellonian University at the time when the Iron Curtain came down after World War II. And he observed the transition from a normal, institution of learning to commissars coming in and explaining how it was going to be and frightening the hell out of the class and basically transforming the whole system into ideological indoctrination from, education. And he observed what happened with the people that were there, and he saw there's a small group of people that resisted, a very large group of people that wanted to kind of stay out of it at all costs because something horrible was happening. They just didn't want to be a part of it. And then another small group of people that were enthusiastic supporters of this change and of this commissar that kind of was imposing his will on the class. So this started him on this journey, and he actually worked with multiple people very underground, right? And what they were doing is what they came to was that essentially communism, and the book, by the way, is called Political Ponerology. It's a little bit hard to read, but I strongly recommend checking it out. Okay, it was written over decades by a group of people. Most of them kind of perished along the way because essentially they make the case. He viewed evil, right? Ponerology, by the way, is the empirical study of evil. And he viewed evil as, essentially these kind of antisocial personality disorder, which is psychopathy, renamed, cluster B personality disorders, these kind of extreme pathologies in human behavior where people essentially conscience leaves them and they can, as a result, they can casually do these things that normal people can't, like kill people without worrying about it, without breaking a sweat or whatever, right? And what he observed was that communist society, right, actually unusually, these people in normal societies, these people kind of mimic, they have to kind of pretend like they're normal people, otherwise they're found out. And throughout most of history, they were killed because they have this characteristic where they can harm people, and do, right, without any remorse or any issue at all. But in communist societies, they're actually elevated, right? So he makes the case, and it's extremely compelling, right, that's why you get the gulag. One reason why you always get the gulag or something like it, right, or the Chinese system, or killed to order, right, is because there's a disproportionate number in the elite echelon of society, in communist societies, of people who have this, basically, he tried to separate the concept of evil from it being kind of like a moral question, like he wanted it to be very biological. That's also very interesting how he tried to do that. But basically, who have these, characteristics of evil, or able to do evil without any remorse, without any thought actually about it. So
yeah, so you say in the book that people who are devoid of empathy, integrity, and restraint rise to the top.
Correct.
And you make the observation that, so there's a relentless, in China, the party doctrine is to relentlessly promote top-down nihilism, a total moral void. And you call it a self-propelled repression machine because there's regionally administered totalitarianism. Can you?
Absolutely. And just another comment. I just recently on American Thought Leaders had Bob Sudinger on the show. Fascinating guy, former CIA analyst, and Clinton NSC, State Department. So, some of the worst decisions around China were made at this time. But he ended up marrying Diamond Liu, a prominent, China human rights advocate. Yeah. And really his mind changed. And he wrote this amazing biography of Hu Yaobang, who's dubbed the conscience of China. Wonderful book, because it actually, when you read it, it's a biography, but it also explains to you how the CCP thinks. And it's very rare for people in this country to understand it for some reason. But I go, Bob, you really got this. Like, this is unbelievable, right? The thing that's in there that's astonishing is this guy who was an ardent Maoist and, kind of changed a little bit towards the end of his life, made it to the pinnacle, to the top of the Chinese Communist Party hierarchy. He was destroyed. His life was destroyed. He was struggling 13 times. The suffering this man endured, right? This is how the system works. It sort of pounds its people into submission, into complete sort of compliance with the party. It's completely unbelievable.
He spoke here.
Yeah. Oh, wonderful.
Yes,
No,
so
it's a true opus. This book. Yeah.
So I guess the lesson then is what you say in the book is the party will stop at nothing to preserve itself.
And this is kind of the punchline, right? But it's hard to grasp until you kind of understand the tools. That's why I've kind of written this book the way I have, right? Yes, in a communist society, in communist China today, let me put it, I'll put it in even a different way, right? Because I've been looking at it from the perspective of medicine, okay? On the one hand, we have what we think of as Hippocratic medicine, okay? What does that mean? It means that I view you, I'm the medical practitioner, I view you as someone I need to heal. I'm just focusing on you, I'm focusing on the totality of who you are, okay? If I'm gonna recommend an intervention, I'm gonna minimize the harm, this do no harm idea, right, with that. And it's sort of this inherent dignity of the individual human being is central to that view of medicine, okay? And actually to the Judeo-Christian tradition as well.
And it's a moral, it's thought of as a moral profession.
It's thought precisely, right? Yeah. The other end of this is something called utilitarian bioethics, okay? And that is a viewpoint of the greatest good for the greatest number, okay? And that means that if it's gonna help the whole, it's okay to sacrifice a few. Of course, that's not very good for the few that get sacrificed, right? But I had this, cathartic. I've been thinking a lot about this because I don't just cover China and American Thought Leaders. I cover a lot of issues. But at one point, as I was writing this book, I thought and said, wait, how many of you are familiar with this concept, right? In order to make an omelet, you have to break a few eggs. Mm-hmm. You've heard this, right? Yeah. Joseph Stalin, typically attributed to Joseph Stalin. Well, it's okay to sacrifice a few for the beautiful revolution, for creating the utopia, the communist utopia. Except, so in communist societies, the greatest good is the survival and supremacy of the Communist Party, always. And that's why in every single communist society, you get atrocity. Why? Because the bottom line is, it's that supremacy that matters. It's the survival that matters. And if you have to break a few eggs along the way, this is like the kind of the apotheosis, the extreme of utilitarian bioethics, of utilitarianism, of treating human beings, and frankly, everything else. Like, I've actually been on a bunch of shows recently talking about how communist China instrumentalized Iran as its own tool for a whole bunch of reasons, right? From a geopolitical perspective, it was a very valuable tool for it. But then when push came to shove, not really helping very much. Are they? It's fascinating to see that. But they instrumentalize absolutely everything, human life, allies, so-called allies, I mean, you name it. It's this very sort of cold, empty, cynical view of humanity. And that, you know, struggle and force and coercion and power, these are only the things that matter ultimately.
I want to get to our final little piece of this before we turn to the audience. I want to hear the questions. But you talk about the complicity of the United States and the West in this horrible practice. And you talk about how the West has been captivated by China, and that there's this grand narrative invented by Henry Kissinger. Can you describe this, and then in concrete terms, how this applies to forced organ harvesting?
Absolutely.
How the West is complicit in this, just briefly. We don't have a lot of time.
When I first got introduced to the whole concept of China and human rights in China, right, I knew, so there's a reason the First Amendment is the First Amendment. And it's a protection of our most fundamental rights from government, frankly, right? Speech, ultimately it's conscience, right? Assembly, religion, but it's conscience, right? In communist China, they were killing people for refusing to give up their faith, okay? The most fundamental right we have. It was very clear to me at that point that this is not a liberalizing society. There's no way. If you're violating those most fundamental things, you know, how many times you're going to tell me you're liberalizing? You're not, right? But this was a 95-5 issue, so to speak, okay, back in the day. Everybody believed it. Republican, Democrat, you know, in Canada, you know, conservative, liberal, whatever. Everybody thought that by pumping enough cash into China, we're going to change them. We're going to make them more democratic. It's going to become Taiwan or South Korea or Japan or something, right? But no, they knew very well what they were doing.
At the very moment when we were introducing them to the World Trade Organization, giving them MFN, this was going, you know, the organ harvesting was getting off the ground.
100%.
Forced organ harvesting.
100%. Yeah. Right? Like imagine this, right? They were experts at bamboozling the barbarians. I say this because this is one of the terms used for the gullible Westerners who are going to help, you know, sort of the rise of the Communist Party. And actually, Jiang Zemin, who started this Falun Gong persecution, was one of these chief bamboozlers. That was his job, right? He had this, you know, I don't want to single out Senator Dianne Feinstein specifically because this happened to many people, but that was one of the deep relationships long before Jiang rose to power that he had cultivated through this kind of thing and sort of fostered this weird, you know, and then for some reason Henry Kissinger decided that this is going to be the way that America, and we all kind of believed it, right? Essentially. I mean, I didn't think about it much because I was a biologist. I just stepped into a situation where it was obvious to me it was false. But it was incredibly difficult to talk to people about this stuff, right? They all wanted to believe that it was this way. You went to media, I had these amazing stories of, you know, really heroic actions of these Falun Gong practitioners who had braved everything to expose the truth, to get out, to escape, and like zero media wanted to touch it. Right? Because it didn't fit the narrative, right? Didn't fit the narrative. And by the way, they also had people reporting in China, and they knew what would happen if they did report on this, right? Because, you know, basically they knew this unwritten rule. I remember, like, you know, Ian Johnson, for example, wrote this amazing series in the early years. He won the Pulitzer for it in the, I think, Wall Street Journal, about the Falun Gong persecution. Again, got banned, right, from China. Later found his way back in kind of a way that makes me a bit sad, but anyway, the point is that you suffered a lot as a journalist. They made you know this. This is how they controlled the narrative from that side.
And they do this with the companies that invest in China as well. You know, the companies were very beguiled by this argument that you know, you get into China so that you can have a leg up on the market when it explodes. That you'll have a piece of that pie.
Well,
and yet
this is incredibly, if I may comment, right? This is an incredibly important part, right? It wasn't just gullibility, okay? They saw our propensity for greed, right? And they really took advantage of that.
But they also, it's been so obvious to everybody by now that rob, replicate, and replace is also their motto when it comes to American companies doing business in China and partnering with the Chinese companies. You give an example, which I didn't even know of. Segway was completely I don't know if you want to say any more about that.
It's just a crazy example because you remember this was a tech that was never really adopted very much for whatever. I think it was too expensive. Well, they used it a little bit, but I think Segway imagined everybody would be riding Segways, right? That never happened. But what they did was Segway went in, wanted to manufacture in China. They had to transfer. I think with Segway, they might have even stolen the IP. I can't remember because there's this rule, right? If you want to work in China and manufacture there, you have to transfer your IP.
You hand over your intellectual property.
You hand over your intellectual property. But basically, what they did is
they
stood up a competitor company either through stolen. I can't remember right now. Either through stolen or transferred IP, and that company ended up buying the original Segway, right? Like that. This is one of the approaches that they use to kind of.
And I think it's the same approach with medical schools and teaching hospitals in the United States that actually have trained up these transplant surgeons, if you can believe it. There have been documented 300 names from their own websites, Chinese transplant surgeons who were trained, received their medical training in the United States. And this goes on today. And it's a combination of, too bad to be believed, beyond belief, and the deceptive practices, of course, of the CCP.
Well, and the cash flows, because the problem. See, this is that once the cash starts flowing, Mark Twain has this comment, right? I think I include this in the book, right? That if you're financially incentivized not to notice something, it's very easy for you to not notice it.
Right.
Right.
I'm not sure the cash flow went in that direction back to the United States, but
no.
certainly with those resistance drugs, it did. It does. But you have these professors from Harvard and University of Pittsburgh. They still have it up on their website. That they have these joint research, joint conferences, grants going, fellowships to the military. Some of them are military controlled hospitals. They're called military hospitals. And I think, as I ponder this, that it's also this notion, when I look at something like the China Medical Board, who was giving lots of money, I think it was Rockefeller money, to Rockefeller Foundation money to transplants to Wang Jiafu's hospital and his transplant center, that they believed also that they were, and they would say this, that they think that this is the way to liberalize and get a voluntary donation system that they were going to make China better.
Well, so just on this comment, this is one of the sort of complicity mechanisms, right? I mean, this has happened so many times, but basically the bamboozler sort of thing would say, look, I'm a reformer, you're working with us, we're on the same team, and then there's these hardliners, and they're in danger of taking power, so don't raise too much of a fuss. Just kind of work with us for a while, and we'll figure it out, and we'll win together. And the hardliners, we don't want it to go back to the old ways. And they just would rinse and repeat this again and again. Nothing changes ever, right? This was one of the strategies.
Yeah, I think we're running out of time, and I do want to get to some questions and maybe say a word about U.S. policy. Tiny word about U.S. policy. So, anybody have any questions?
I do have a question. Sorry, I spoke out earlier.
Why don't you wait for the mic?
Okay. The question I had, because you talk about breaking eggs, okay? The complicity then, in this elaborate way that you explained it so beautifully, is that you have doctors that have to know that certain patients will have to go to China then, find a hospital there, have the transplant done there. So in effect, there's a complicit relationship they avert their eyes to. Am I correct? And the other question I have, of all these people from all over the world that are coming over to China to get these barbaric human organ harvested organs, how many are from the United States? Are they coming from around the world? Because, we're not too far from, you had Marian Anderson singing about civil rights and anti-slavery just right over here.
Well, that's a good question and gets into the U.S. policy too. So why don't you answer that?
There's two parts to the question. One of them is, part of the answer is that we believe that some transplant centers, we have evidence from one, not in America, in Germany, that when they have a situation that isn't solvable for them, they might feed them information about the China option, right? And I'm aware of, there's one case that I describe in the book like this. But again, the information is scant. Not a lot of people want to admit this is happening. In terms of the numbers, we don't know but it seems like around China, within China itself, of course, the most, but around China, there's more of it. There's one of the great pieces of evidence is a South Korean film crew that, in a very daring way with hidden cameras, went in and basically tried to procure organs and got some crazy responses on camera, right? And so because South Korea is one of these tourist, transplant tourism places, Taiwan was big, South Korea, of course, North Korea. And then as you go out, there's less of it, but there's certainly prominent examples from the US. There's even a whole book written called Larry's Kidney from like 06 or 09. I think it was 09 maybe, where the guy it's like it's the weirdest piece of evidence you'd ever find, because a guy goes to China, his relative writes a hilarious story about him realizing that the kidney he gets is not really from ethical sources. I still don't know what to make of this particular book, because it's got all these reviews like, this is great, this is hilarious. It's like, yeah, I bet someone's dead for an organ. It's kind of weird, right? Anyway, we don't know the exact numbers. It's very hard to track. That's why the error bars are so big. We're talking 60 to 100,000. We don't know exactly. We just know what the range is, and frankly, it's likely to be quite a bit larger. We're just trying to work with the most conservative view of the numbers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, over here. You first, second. And can you identify yourself, please?
Yes, my name's Jan Jekielek. Do you see that with the proliferation and if it'll be increased and more viable 3D printing organs via stem cell research, that the genocide will pivot or it would lessen?
This is a really interesting question, okay? I'll tell you what I've been thinking about. I'm going to answer a tiny bit obliquely here, okay? There's a new technology, I think it's entering phase 3 trials, looks really promising. It's basically a box that can keep a kidney perfused for 2 days. This is going to be life-saving technology for right now, there's nothing remotely like that. Once you pull a kidney out, it degrades really fast, okay? Even the existing technologies aren't that great to hold them, to keep them. But this would really change the game. A lot more people will live because you can keep that organ alive, right? After that catastrophic accident happens, right? The flip side of it, the knife's edge of that, is that now you'll be able to ship a kill-to-order organ from China anywhere in the world, okay? And so we should have very strong, talk about policy, we should have really strong export controls around this kind of technology, for sure. Now, of course, they're going to try to steal it, re-engineer it, et cetera. But at least we can put a line in the sand. It's an amazing technology. So the technologies, they always seem to have this double-edged piece. One would hope that if this works, which, by the way, it's not at a stage where it's really doable yet, as far as I'm aware, anywhere, right? Even in these illicit, anything-goes labs in China, so to speak, that it would replace it. You won't need it anymore. The problem is, right, and we've seen this, even in our society, right? Once you build a $9 billion machine that involves hundreds of thousands of people doing horrible things that will never admit to what they're doing, with a few very, 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 very rare exceptions, it's hard to dismantle that, right? Because a lot of people are getting paid, a lot of people are complicit, they don't want to admit to it. I mean, it's difficult to do that. This is part of the problem. For policy, if we're going to talk about policy, right? The first sort of policy is let's just not be complicit in it. At least we can not train Chinese transplant surgeons ever, right? Until an independent body assesses that this thing has been dismantled, right? Of course, their own admissions mean nothing. We know that. We have 40 years of evidence to know that, right? But yeah, absolutely, we cannot provide ECMO machines to China, which is important kind of technology they use to transplant multiple organs from a body. we cannot provide solutions, we cannot provide funding, have these deep research partnerships. I mean, it's all crazy, right? Like just, I mean,
And there's no legislation really
Nothing.
directed towards that.
Nothing.
I mean,
Nothing.
even pending.
Well,
There's
no,
there are
pending
two,
there is.
But to stop the medical,
So it's, okay, this is an interesting nuance because, so there's been something called the Falun Gong Protection Act that did, the House passed it, then it was kind of stalled in the Senate, it got reintroduced again. It was actually Marco Rubio's bill, he gave it to Cruz when he became Secretary of State. And on the Senate side, and now it's actually very exciting. It's been reintroduced as a Cruz-Merkley bill, the Falun Gong and Victims of Forced Organ Harvesting Protection Act. Okay, very good piece of legislation. But there's some, they added a few things. They changed the title, but they removed a part which said it is the policy of the U.S. government to not cooperate. I mean, I don't remember the exact language, but basically not cooperate with the Chinese transplant industry. I don't know the reason, right, for this. It might be because, technical assistants at the State Department told them this is not implementable the way it's written. It could, I'm not gonna second guess. I want to see, this is great legislation to pass, just for the record, okay, with that provision or not. But I think it would be great to have something like that just sort of identifies the US government position largely as we don't cooperate with this regime as long as it's functioning.
then
right?
there's the Chris Smith bill, the Stop Forced Organ Harvesting Act.
Absolutely. Another
which-
excellent piece of
Which
legislation.
has also passed the House, but not the Senate.
That's
and,
right.
And we really need to push for that.
So but to frame this, right, like for the first time ever, right, we've got two pieces of legislation that have passed the House near unanimously and are now in the Senate in a bipartisan fashion, ready to rock. Now, of course, we know the CCP in some way is working very hard to make sure these things don't make it to the floor. I think if they make it to the floor, they pass, right? Because it's like no one's going, this is the most nonpartisan issue you can possibly imagine, right? Sort of counter forced organ harvesting. Right, well, sure, as well. But there's even a third piece of legislation in committee in the House from Congressman Neil Dunn, called the Block Act, which is sort of, it functions, there's 6 states that have passed legislation that basically stops Medicare, Medicaid insurance for paying for China transplants. 44 states to go, but there's even a federal piece. So there's a third piece of legislation in the House and committee dealing with this issue. It's kind of an unprecedented time. It's like the US has taken leadership position now on trying to deal with this issue at the basically legislative level, both at the state and the federal level. The issue is to get these things passed. Yeah.
Well, Jan, thank you so much for your book. It's a fascinating read. It's an important read. There are lessons for our own security and for our own ethical standards. And the books are available outside the door. They're available on Amazon. And so I want to thank you. And thank you for coming today, and thank all of you for being here as well.
And so if you're interested in the book, killedtoorder.com, that takes you right to the Amazon link, or ask for it in your bookstore, because they'll order it, and they'll probably order a few copies. We're trying, this is the first week, we're excited. It's the first time, really, I think that our social consciousness, our collective consciousness is ready for this issue. That's to my eye.
Yes.
That's the reason the book exists. Thank you. Nina, this has been incredible. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.